Welcome everyone. Hi, I'm Christina Gordon. I'm the Executive Director of the Women's Foundation of Boston. Thank you for joining us today for the Women's Foundation of Boston's third Women's Empowerment webinar series. We're thrilled that you all have joined us. Just a little background on our organization. The Women's Foundation of Boston creates, funds, and accelerates programs that equip Boston's women and girls to be financially independent, successful, and valued leaders in their communities. We have become the central vehicle for investing in women and girls in the greater Boston area. And we've built a thriving network of female leaders in the nonprofit and business communities. The Women's Foundation of Boston was founded in 2017 to fill the gap of the massive underinvestment in women and girls nationally as well as locally. The founders discovered that only 1.6% of US philanthropic giving is directed towards women and girls serving organizations, and that almost half of that is sent overseas. The founders were motivated to address this shocking philanthropic void. Upon researching the local landscape and realizing there wasn't a large, vibrant foundation directed towards women and girls' economic empowerment, like there were in 44 other states in our country, the founders recognized this inconsistency and they thought it was unacceptable and that Boston really deserved an effective foundation directed towards women and girls. As businesswomen, we, the team at the Women's Foundation of Boston, apply our investment and strategic lens to creating and managing our organization and to our granting. We utilize our financial background and strategic business backgrounds and our passion for the power of data and measuring impact to move our important mission forward. Our vision has clearly filled a gap and resonated with our local community as our growth has been exponential. Our exclusive focus on economic empowerment is very intentional because one, a woman's economic status improves when a woman's economic status improves, all of her life variables go up as well as for her children's. Two, women reinvest 90% of their incomes in their families and communities, which creates a multiplier effect. And three, as businesswomen, we are highly competent at evaluating the economic viability of projects and nonprofits. We have committed over $2 million in grants to women and girls serving nonprofits since our inception by year end, and we have impacted over 3,000 women and girls in greater Boston by empowering them to become financially independent. Our all-volunteer organization boasts almost 75 to 80 high-powered women and girls that help us continue to expand. We have become the go-to organization for women and girls, and we're proud to fill that important role. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, which I'm thrilled about, Jana Amin. Jana is an Egyptian-American youth activist. She is a high school senior with a passion for international relations and gender studies. An avid speaker, Jana has given TEDx talk on changing the narrative among Muslim women, and she even won a national championship exploring the issue of post-truth. She has presented her research on the media's representation of Muslim women at various universities and conferences. And she's even curated an exhibit at the American University in Cairo. Obviously, Jana is an extremely impressive young woman, but she's also humble, approachable, and extremely positive. Her optimism and energy is infectious, and I'm honored to have her present to the Women's Foundation of Boston community. Jana will present about her 5 steps to becoming a confident, persuasive, and effective public speaker. She will share her passion for public speaking. She has competed at over 50 local and national speech tournaments. Through public speaking, Jana has become comfortable using her voice to not only talk about her own experiences, but also to advocate for others, particularly girls and women, hence the connection with us. Jana distills her experience into 5 actionable steps to help women and girls lift up themselves and their communities. As an activist and public speaker, Jana's goal is to inspire girls and women to take control of their own narratives. I'm thrilled you are all joining us for this unique opportunity to hear Jana's story and to learn how to become a compelling, confident, persuasive, and effective public speaker, be it for an interview, a presentation at work or school, or an audience of 1,000. A few logistical details. This webinar is being recorded, so those who have to leave early will be able to watch the full webinar. Additionally, please feel free to type questions into the chat box to the host labeled Ask a Question Here. Jana will be thrilled to answer questions after her formal presentation. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Jana.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, and welcome everybody. It's so great to see you all here, and thank you so much for joining me. So I'm going to share my screen to the presentation. So as you hopefully by now know, you are listening to my talk about 5 steps to becoming a confident, persuasive, and effective public speaker. So before we kind of get to the steps, the first thing I want to start with is by introducing myself. So as Mrs. Gordon mentioned, I am Jana Amin, a senior at Milton Academy and an Egyptian-born Muslim American. I'm super passionate about international relations, political science, development, and Middle Eastern studies, and I'm especially interested in gender studies in Islam. I'm also an international advocate for gender parity, and I'll talk a little bit about how my public speaking skills have really enabled me to take the global change and advocate for the communities and issues that I care about. So before we get there, a little bit about my experience with public speaking. So as Mrs. Gordon mentioned, I've spoken on the TEDx stage, sharing with young people like some of you all, the importance of changing the narrative around Muslim women. And just recently, I spoke at the UN General Assembly on a panel whose focus was to examine and share policies that would help further the UN's Sustainable Development Goal agenda. So I've really spoken, from little audiences in my classroom to big audiences like the UN General Assembly, and I've been lucky enough to share my message and develop my public speaking skills while doing all that. And so I'm incredibly excited to share with you all how I ended up here, because I started off, with my public speaking journey in the 6th grade. I was incredibly, incredibly nervous, very anxious public speaker, and kind of a bad one. My voice was incredibly high pitched. I spoke very, very fast, something I'm still working on. And I don't think I really connected with my audience the same way I could have to make my speeches more powerful. And I think that's kind of the first message I have for you all, is that becoming a confident, effective, and persuasive public speaking takes a lot of practice. And so I think before we can get to kind of some of the tangible steps, a lot of my friends often come up to me and ask me, and they're like, Jana, what do you find scary about public speaking? Because I'm terrified. And, when I ask them the question, what are some of their fears and what makes them nervous public speakers, I often get some of the responses you see here on the slide. So things like, I'm going to embarrass myself, or I'm not confident to speak about this, or people are going to hate what I say. And these are all totally natural, okay, valid responses to public speaking, because public speaking can be scary, especially if you don't know how to approach it. And so my hope is that by the end of today's webinar, you will all understand how to become better public speakers. And hopefully with that will come a little bit more confidence and a little less fear when it comes to the words public speaking and to actually taking the stage and being a public speaker. And so throughout my journey, I found that the key is really to practice, 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 and even more practice. I did not become the public speaker I am today without hours and hours of practice. Like I mentioned, when I started my public speaking journey in the 6th grade by joining my school's speech team, I was incredibly lucky to have access to other peers who helped me become a confident public speaker. But it did not come overnight. I had to learn how to use my gestures, how to use eye contact. What did that even mean? How to build and craft a speech. And so hopefully today you'll get a distilled version of 5 steps to make you better public speakers. But do remember that becoming a better public speaker doesn't just come from one workshop or webinar. It's really a journey that I think we're all on, because we can all become better public speakers. And so hopefully that's something that you'll really understand today. Without further ado, the first step to becoming a better public speaker is picking a topic you are truly passionate about. It's obviously much harder to speak about climate change if you don't even believe in climate change in the first place. And so above all, it's incredibly important that you connect with the topic you are talking about. When you have that connection, I think your audience really feels connected to you as a speaker and can relate to the topic you are talking about. It also makes it much, much easier to go through a 5-minute speech or a 10-minute speech about a topic if you are passionate about it. But it also should be a topic you not only care about, but also know something about. And so a good kind of rule of thumb that I often employ in my own life is asking myself the question, can I have a 5-minute conversation or a 10-minute conversation or even a 45-minute conversation with another person about this topic? If the answer to that question is yes, and you are really an active participant in that conversation, then that probably means that you are more than perfect to talk about this topic because you are knowledgeable about it and you have enough to say about the topic. Of course, if you're not starting off with a very big background in the topic that you want to talk about, that's totally okay too. Just make sure you do enough research and learning and listening so that you can talk confidently about the topic you care about. Once you've kind of figured out, what topic you want to talk about, the next step is really to decide what format will you be giving the speech in. And so over here on this slide, you'll see I have divided those into 3 categories. The first being memorizing, the second reading, and the third off-the-cuff speaking. So I'll explain to you all a little bit about the pros and cons of each. But before I do that, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're all going to have to memorize a speech at some point, read a speech at some point, and even do an off-the-cuff talk at another point. And so these 3 skills are all incredibly different, but also incredibly important. And while they do have pros and cons, I encourage you to really think critically about which ones you feel most confident about and which ones you feel least comfortable with, and practice all 3 of them because they will come in handy later on in your life. So first we have memorizing. So memorizing is when you write down your entire speech, you workshop it, read it aloud over and over again to, get out any kinks and coils in the script, and then you start memorizing it, which means committing it to memory. And so that will obviously take you a lot of time, but it definitely makes you feel more secure because if you have practiced your memorized speech over and over again, and you are really confident in your memorization skills, then you kind of have eradicated the fear that you're going to forget what you're saying. And that can help you feel much more secure on the day you take the stage. Next, we have reading. And so with reading, you still have to write a speech and maybe even, memorize portions of the speech or workshop portions of the speech. But it is nice since you have a paper in your hand. I think one thing that often trips people up when they do have a script in their hand is that there's this tendency to look down over and over again. And when you're looking down, your audience finds it much harder to connect with you on a human level. That's something that I see a lot as the co-captain of my school speech team. When we're auditioning new people, they are incredibly excited to be on the team and want a spot on our team. And really, are incredibly, incredibly energetic. And yet I often find them reading from their phones or from a printed piece of paper, what they're supposed to say. And I kind of lose some of that energy because I'm no longer seeing their eyes or their face. And that's kind of, the primary way that we all communicate with each other, through the eyes and the face. And so when you're reading, make sure you are aware of your eye contact. And maybe you even want to write on your script a couple of, little eyes or dots that will remind you that this is a really good place to look up to your audience and make a connection with them. And then finally, we have off the cuff speaking, which arguably is the hardest. And so off the cuff speaking, otherwise known as impromptu speaking, is, when you have not necessarily written down your entire speech, you just kind of have a couple of themes in your mind that you want to speak about. And I think this can definitely be the most stressful because people are often worried they're going to completely forget about what they're going to say or mess up in the middle of a sentence. And I mean, I have to admit that off the cuff speaking is, one area of public speaking that I've really had to work hard on because I personally found it the most nerve-wracking. One thing that I found incredibly helpful and that has really helped me become a better off the cuff speaker is writing down notes beforehand. And so I often hear people say, "Oh, yes, I have this presentation tomorrow. I'm all set." And I'm like, "Oh, that's awesome. Like, what are you going to talk about?" And they're like, "Oh, I'll figure it out tomorrow." And that really worries me and stresses me out because if you haven't really written down an outline for your speech, I think that's when you can become a little bit rambly in your speaking or go off on random tangents or get nervous and kind of clam up and be unable to really talk about the issue that you want to be talking about confidently and persuasively. And so do write down notes beforehand, even if they are just a couple of bullet points. An example of kind of doing this, so a couple of weeks ago, as I mentioned, I spoke at the UN General Assembly, and the format was that of a panel. So I was surrounded by panelists, and I really wanted to make sure I got across my message, which was that gender parity is and should be a crucial priority for our roles in the coming 10 years. And so I wanted to, cover a couple of statistics about gender parity, like the fact that 20 million fewer girls are going to be returning back to school because of the coronavirus crisis. And so I wrote down all the different statistics that I wanted to cover during my presentation and my panel discussion, and I put them in a notes document just on my phone. And then, 20, 30 minutes before I joined the panel, I looked them over and then I put them to the side. When you take the stage, do not look at your notes because that will kind of confine you into a space and you'll be searching for something to read when you haven't written the speech and there's nothing to read. And so for me on the UN panel, the moderator was just asking us questions off the cuff. So I had to be able to weave in those statistics into my answers. And so by looking at them before, I could trust that deep down in my tummy or heart, I knew exactly what to say and what to cover. And I just kind of had to trust my train of thought to lead the audience to the overall points that I wanted to make. So next is to know your audience. And knowing your audience really helps you become a better public speaker. And so some questions that you should ask yourself to help you figure out who your audience is and what your speech should look like to be tailored to that audience is things like, are you speaking in a classroom? Are you speaking to a group of professors? Are you speaking at work? And we'll talk a little bit more about what knowing your audience looks like, but just kind of as an example on the personal level, I know that if I'm presenting in front of my classmates at school, my presentation is going to look very, very different than perhaps my TEDx talk is going to look like. And that's because the audience is different and their knowledge about what you're talking about is probably very different too. So knowing your audience can really help you figure out how much humor to use. If you're talking about, climate change and its impacts on the world by 2030 and how certain, Pacific islands are going to be sunk by then, you probably don't want to be that funny because it is a really, really serious topic. And you want to make sure to reflect the seriousness of the topic and of your audience in your speech. At the same time, if you're talking to a group of your classmates at a school presentation, it's probably a great idea to use humor because otherwise they'll get really bored really fast. And so using humor can be a great way to keep your audience engaged depending on the scenario. Then, of course, there's how long you're speaking for. I usually give the example of, a group of kindergartners who probably don't want to listen to me or anybody else drone on for any longer than 10, 20, 30 minutes. If you're talking to a group of professors, however, they may be more inclined to listen to you for, hours at a time, depending on the situation. And so knowing who you're speaking to, whether that's age, whether that's the context, will help you figure out how long you're speaking for, which is incredibly important when you're charting out what you're going to say, and when, and in what format too. Then, knowing your audience can help you figure out how detailed can you get. So again, if I'm talking about gender parity efforts to a group of kindergartners versus, a group of professors or even my classmates, I think those two discussions are going to look very, very different. So to the group of kindergartners, I can obviously be extremely honest with them and tell them about the differences between how women and men are treated on a world scale, or how boys and girls interact with each other in the classroom. But I'm probably not going to, list a number of statistics and very high level abstract theoretical approaches to gender parity and solving the problem, because they're probably not going to understand me. And so figuring out who you're speaking to can really help you figure out how detailed can you get. And finally, the last thing that I think knowing your audience can really help you suss out is how persuasive do you really have to be? So if you're speaking to a group of people who do not believe in climate change, and your passion is climate change, then you're probably going to have to be extremely, extremely persuasive. At the same time, if you're talking to a group of people who agree with you that climate change is a priority, you maybe don't need to be that persuasive about whether or not climate change is an issue, and can instead use that time to explore different approaches to solving climate change or making significant strides as a community towards fixing climate change. And so, figuring out who you're speaking to can be an incredibly important tool to figuring out how persuasive you have to be. So next, and this is kind of the final point we'll cover in terms of crafting your content of this speech before we move on to some delivery tips that can help you become better public speakers once you've written your speech or figured out how to give a speech. So the third tip is to start with a compelling AGD. And I'll get to what an AGD is in just 1 second. But one thing that I really love starting with is a personal story or a funny anecdote. And, throughout the years, I've had many, many speeches, and a lot of them have started off with a personal story. And so what is an attention-getting device, or an AGD? More or less, it's what you are starting with, which is why it is supposed to be attention-getting. It's a way to hook your audience in and convince them that this problem or this issue that you're speaking about is very, very important and worth their time. And so I often recommend starting with a personal story of some kind, because it really makes your speech more relatable and can help your audience connect to you on a personal level before you lead them through the following points. Also, your attention-getting device can really help you establish your credibility, your connection to the topic, and honestly, can help you lead into the topic in a really fun and human way. And so when it comes to a personal story, there are some different ways to figure out which personal story you should use for your attention-getting device. So I think one thing that we can often be really scared to do in a speech is be vulnerable, because it is extremely hard to be vulnerable in a speech. I know a couple of years ago in my 8th grade year, I was giving a speech about post-truth. So basically explaining to my audience and convincing them that we were suddenly living in a world where opinions mattered more than facts, and that this was a real issue and had, very negative implications on our society. And, everyone really liked this speech, and I got feedback that it was a wonderfully written speech, but it wasn't doing as well in competition as I had hoped, and it certainly wasn't connecting with people on a personal level, despite the fact that I had personal stories from other people, across the speech. And so it was only when I really took a step back and, realized that I needed to be vulnerable in the speech, and thus shared a vulnerable story with my audience, that I found people connecting to the topic and to the content of my speech way more than they had before. So I ended up talking about how, as a Muslim American, some of the comments made in the media about Muslims, and fake comments that Muslims are all terrorists, for example, really hurt me and made me feel like I didn't belong in the US. And so it was when I shared that moment of vulnerability with my audience, that I would have people come up to me crying after my speech and saying, "Oh my goodness, thank you. I now understand why post-truth is such an important topic for us to discuss." And so I think really starting with a personal story that is vulnerable, or at least being vulnerable somewhere throughout your speech, can make it a lot more powerful. Of course, though, when you're thinking about which personal story to start with, and particularly a vulnerable personal story, make sure you still feel comfortable sharing that story with your audience. You, of course, should never do or say anything that doesn't make you feel comfortable, because that's the most important thing at the end of the day. And so kind of within those parameters are how you can choose a personal story that leaves you and shows you to be a vulnerable person who is willing to put themselves on the line somewhat for the topic you're talking about. On the complete opposite side of personal stories that you can choose to start with as your attention getting device is a funny or casual story. And I think these can actually be just as effective as vulnerable stories, depending on the situation. And so starting with something funny can really allow you to connect with your audience and connect with them at a very basic level, especially if that humor is self-deprecating, or if it's, a shared scenario that many people in your audience kind of can share or can relate to. And I think often in speeches, we have this belief that we have to be really, really stiff and serious, when that's usually not the case. People really do love to kind of start off on equal ground with something funny or casual, and then kind of move into some of the more seriousness or serious topics. And then finally, I think the last category of personal stories, and one really important thing to remember while you're crafting your personal story for your attention getting device in a speech, is that your personal story should be directly related to your topic. I think the worst thing is that, you start speaking and you've spoken for 2 or 3 minutes and your audience is extremely engaged, but then suddenly you pivot in a completely different direction and start talking about goodness knows what. I think not only does that leave your audience feeling somewhat betrayed, but I think that can also leave your audience feeling confused, which is the last thing you ever want an audience to be. And so just make sure that the connection between your personal story and your topic is incredibly clear, and that you can draw a straight line between that personal story and how you got to the issue that you are talking about. So then that kind of wraps up some of the advice I have about crafting your content to be persuasive in particular. And we'll talk a little bit more about, why public speaking, and especially the content that you're talking about, can be such a powerful tool in today's society, once we cover some of the delivery tips that I have. So I've broken the delivery tips into 2. The first being be authentic. And I think that's, a tip that I have for all of you all when you're giving speeches, is that authenticity is really, really crucial to making you connect with the audience and engage them. So often I see people with the belief, especially my friends at school, with the belief that public speaking means that they kind of need to take on a different persona, especially if that persona is more serious. When that's really not the case. Anyone can get a piece of paper and write down everything you're saying and just read it to themselves. But that's not the point of public speaking. People are there to hear what you have to say. And so it's very important that you let your personality shine through your speech, because that makes it all the more powerful. So what does being authentic actually look like? So some things I'm going to talk about are how to use your gestures, your vocal variety, and your facial expressions to help you become a more authentic speaker. So I think some ways we can practice our gestures, vocal variety, or facial expressions are the ones on this slide. But above all, gestures, vocal variety, and facial expressions are incredibly important, because they not only help you connect to the audience, but also engage them in many different ways. And so I often say that gestures are a way to emphasize what you are saying. Vocal variety is a way to really make sure that what you are saying matches how you are saying it. And so if I'm talking about something incredibly sad and I'm, speaking as if I'm incredibly excited or happy, there will be some sort of dissonance with the audience. And that's definitely not something we ever want in our audience members. Similarly, if I'm talking about something that's really, really exciting, but I look really, really sad or confused, and my facial expressions aren't matching what I'm saying, then again, we have a problem. And so being able to use your gestures, your vocal variety, and your facial expressions to emphasize and uplift what you're saying will really help you become a better public speaker. So my first tip is to use a mirror to practice your facial expressions. This can be very uncomfortable, especially when you start off, but throughout my years of public speaking, I found that it is so helpful to stand in front of a mirror in my bathroom or bedroom and literally just say my speech over and over again using a mirror. I think when you see yourself speaking, you can figure out, what is your face doing? And that's something that we often don't think about when we're speaking and interacting with people on a day-to-day basis. But it's very, very important because you never want to be speaking about something that is incredibly sad, like the number of lives we've lost because of the COVID-19 disease, and look incredibly excited while saying it. There's some sort of cognitive dissonance that we all experience when we see someone whose facial expressions don't match what they're saying and how they're saying it. And so using a mirror can really help you fish out any facial expressions that don't match what you're saying. And I think they can help you also create some sort of variety and variation with your public speaking and your facial expressions. So my next piece of advice would be to record yourself while speaking. And I think this one is probably the most uncomfortable public speaking advice you all will ever get. But it is extremely, extremely helpful to you really emphasizing, and helping you practice those good habits in public speaking that we like to see. And so by recording yourself, I think one thing to really look out for is your vocal variety. Are you varying your voice and the tone of your voice, the structure of your voice, the pitch of your voice, the volume of your voice enough? Or are you kind of speaking in a very monotone way? By recording yourself, you can kind of listen to yourself and really through a critical lens, think to yourself if what you're saying and how you're saying it are matching, but also if they are engaging and exciting and are constantly taking your audience on an emotional roller coaster. And then the next piece of advice I have is to really practice out loud. And this one is one that I cannot emphasize enough. I get people all the time who tell me that they're super, super nervous for a speech they have this coming week. And yet they've never practiced the speech out loud. And I think that that is a really big mistake because when you practice out loud, you can kind of hone in on any interruptions in the fluency of your script or figure out which spots you need to practice over and over again. I think practicing out loud can also help you think about which spots in your speech need a little bit more reassurance or reaffirmation. And so if I'm getting tripped up continuously on a certain portion of my speech, that probably just means I need to practice it out loud more and more and more. And so by practicing out loud, you get more comfortable with the words you're saying, and your brain and your subconscious learns what it feels like to say this speech and to talk about this topic. And I think that just helps elevate you as a public speaker automatically. And then finally, my favorite tip to becoming a better public speaker and using your gestures, vocal variety, and facial expressions to your benefit is to do some speech warm-ups. So we're all going to try something together. On my speech team, we do speech warm-ups before every tournament. And I have kind of continued that practice throughout my public speaking world. And so if I'm giving a workshop like this one, or if I'm speaking at the UN like I did a couple of weeks ago, I will take a couple of minutes before that to do some of these warm-ups. And so I want you all to stay on mute, but to do kind of like a call and response with this warm-up. And this warm-up in particular really helps you work on your enunciation and your pronunciation so that you are articulating the words that we are saying. But it also helps you kind of loosen up and have some fun, which is incredibly important to kind of wash away any nerves you have right before you take the stage. So this speech warm-up is called Weather the Weather. So we'll kind of start and then go from there. So like I said, it's going to be call and response. So I'll say a line and then you all say it, and then we'll kind of go back and forth from there. So, whether the weather is cold, whether the weather is hot, we'll be together whatever the weather, whether we like it or not. So that's it. It's very, very simple. I'll repeat it again all together, and you all can try to join me in while you're on mute to practice it, and maybe even write it down so that you can use it later before you take the stage. So, whether the weather is cold, whether the weather is hot, we'll be together whatever the weather, whether we like it or not. And the whole point of this warm-up is that you do it and you say these lines a couple of times over, and that you get faster and faster and faster as you go. So when you start, your focus should really be on your diction. Are you properly pronouncing every single word? And as you've probably noticed in this warm-up, it is especially important to practice the weather part, because that helps move your mouth in ways that it doesn't necessarily move, especially not that rapidly in a normal everyday conversation. And so by saying that warm-up, you can really help make sure that you get out any kinks and stumbles out of your speaking. And so again, what we would do in a speech tournament situation or right before I take the stage is I would say this warm-up over and over again until I get really, really fast. And just as a sense of example, I'll show you what really, really fast looks like while still trying to enunciate as much as possible. Whether the weather is cold, whether the weather is hot, we'll be together whatever the weather, whether we like it or not. There you go. So the more you do that, the better you'll get at enunciating your words. And I think hopefully it'll be a little bit fun, especially if you recruit a teammate or a classmate or even, a workplace friend to help you practice that right before you take the stage. And it can just be a fun way to let go of those nerves right before a speech. So next, my final tip to becoming a better public speaker is being authentic. And I think, being authentic means using the space and making lots and lots of eye contact with your audience. And that's something that, can often be hard in a virtual setting, but still can be done in many different ways that we'll talk about in just one moment. And so I think using the space, actually, before we get to using the space, we'll talk a little bit about why being authentic is important, period. And so one thing that my coach always used to tell me, especially in middle school, is that I am presenting, i.e. giving a present or a gift to my audience. And I think that's incredibly, incredibly important. Sometimes we kind of get into this phase of overthinking when we think that everybody in our audience is looking to, be critical about every single word we say and every single time we mess up and every we say, every we say, etc. When in reality, your audience really wants to be there for you, be supportive of you, and for the most part, uplift you and, take your advice and listen to your thoughts. If you're in front of an audience, they probably want to hear what you have to say. And so I think it's very, very important to think about how you are in a conversation of some kind with the audience, even if they are not necessarily responding to you. But you owe it to them to take a huge deep breath before you start, to allow them to get settled and calm your own nerves down and make them feel comfortable and at ease in the space that you are in, even if that is a virtual space. And then, of course, we come to eye contact. And I think another way of making your audience feel valued is giving each audience member what I like to call an eye contact moment. And that basically means that instead of scanning the room or scanning the Zoom call, really be intentional about looking at different people, or if you're on a Zoom, different spots of your computer a couple of times to make each person feel seen. And that's something that we would automatically do in a conversation, but we can kind of let that get sidelined when we're giving a public speech. And so make sure you do give each audience member their eye contact moment. One way that I practice this, and I especially used to do this when I was a little bit younger, but I do it all the time. So don't be embarrassed if you have to do it, because it's a great way to practice your eye contact. But basically, recruit some family members, some friends, even put some teddy bears on your bed. Or if you don't have teddy bears, that's okay. Put any objects you have, whether that's like 6 different water bottles or 6 different chairs with nobody in them. Just put, one collection of objects in one space. And while you're practicing your speech out loud, make a concerted effort to look at each one of those objects equally. And instead of going, "Hi, my name is," really quickly, kind of scanning through the room and scanning through your objects, speak around one sentence or half a sentence to each of those objects or people, so that you really are giving each audience member their eye contact moment and allowing them to connect with you on a personal level for at least 1 second. Another way to kind of practice this is to ask yourself, if I'm an audience member, do I like when people look at me or not? And I'm sure most of you do feel like you are more connected to the speaker if the speaker directly looks in your direction. And so, of course, if you have a much larger audience of 1,000 people or even 10,000 people, you probably don't have enough time in your speech to look at each one of those people individually. And that's totally okay. Just pick a couple of key figures in the crowd that are kind of a basis for who you should be looking at throughout your speech. And then I think my final piece of advice for when you're presenting is to smile. And I think that's something that we can often forget when we're on Zoom calls, when we're in front of a large audience, when we're really, really nervous. But smiling not only helps reassure your audience and makes you seem approachable, but I think it also helps you as a speaker feel calmer and more composed. And so by smiling and, of course, taking a deep breath before you start, you allow your audience to feel at ease with you as a speaker, and feel more comfortable in the space you are in. And speaking of the space you are in, I think one question that I've been getting a lot while we're here in the virtual space is how to use space when we're kind of all confined to these little boxes on a computer screen. And that's a really great question, because, a really important thing to keep in mind when you're giving a talk in a public setting is to move around a couple of times, really seem grounded in the places where you decide to stop, and do big gestures to really draw people in. But as you just saw, those big gestures don't necessarily work over a Zoom screen. So you kind of just want to be mindful of the confinements of a space, though you, of course, can still, look at a corner of your laptop, and that kind of makes it seem as if you're like particularly examining someone or something. If you lean back or you lean forward, that can also help you seem more engaged at certain areas of the speech, and might help provide a little bit more spontaneity to your talk if you're giving one in this virtual world. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about why public speaking is so important and how public speaking has really helped me as a person and as an advocate for my community. So I think the first way public speaking has really helped me is as an advocate for my community. And so, as I mentioned, I'm extremely passionate about gender parity, which is why I was so excited to speak at the Women's Foundation of Boston. But I really do believe that, a world of gender equality is a world where we are all more prosperous and better people, and also, have better economies and more robust infrastructures. And so, my public speaking journey didn't really begin with advocating for gender parity, though. It began when I moved from Egypt in the 5th grade to the United States, and realized that the women, especially the Muslim women in my own community back home in Egypt, were very different from the Muslim women that my peers and teachers in the US imagined, but also those Muslim women that I saw in the media. And so it was kind of this discrepancy between the Muslim women I knew in Egypt and those I saw in the media that really propelled me to begin telling my story, and more specifically, the story of the Muslim women that I knew. The fact that they were all driven, impassioned, and empowered, as opposed to being portrayed in the media as, victims of oppression, submissive servants, or even terrorists. And just by telling that story and the story of the Muslim women that I knew and how I felt and what it was like to be a Muslim woman in the United States, I slowly but surely began advocating for my community and uplifting, I think, the Muslim women in the United States, but also the global efforts to change the narrative around Muslim women globally. And so the more I kind of began telling my story and using my voice and practicing those public speaking skills, the more powerful advocate I became for my community. And I think that's something that applies to everyone. If there's an issue that you care about that specifically impacts you or your immediate community or even just the global community, but has some sort of personal relevance to you, do not underestimate the power of public speaking to help you advocate for that issue. It is such an important tool and can really, really, I think, help you connect with the international stage and help at least move a couple of issues in your community forward that you care about. I think the next way that public speaking can be an incredibly powerful tool is in changing people's minds. Obviously, we all like to change people's minds, even if it is just in a silly debate over which yogurt to buy or, is water wet, for example. Really silly questions like that, changing people's minds can come in handy. But I think even on a larger scale, being able to change people's minds is an incredibly important skill. Over the past 6 years, I've been doing a category of speech at my school called original oratory, which basically means that you get 10 minutes to persuade your audience about a specific topic. And I've, talked about everything from cultural awareness for everyone to the importance of history, to even changing the narrative around Muslim women. And I think the most powerful moments have been when people come up to me after a speech and say, do you know what? I had never thought of Muslim women as being empowered and impassioned, but the next time I see a Muslim woman on the street, I'm going to catch myself and say, oh, she could be just like me underneath her veil. And I think it's comments like that that really make you realize how incredible public speaking is and how important it is in playing a role in changing people's minds. And so if there is an issue that you care about, do not underestimate the power of public speaking in changing other people's minds, and definitely use it to your advantage. And I think, I talked a little bit about what makes for a robust speech earlier on in terms of content. But I quickly want to add that to really create a persuasive speech, not just an effective speech, you want to apply what we call logos and ethos, and also your personal stories. And so logos is kind of like the logic. And so you want to establish that you as a speaker are able to think in a scientific way, in a critical way, through a critical lens, and you want to take your audience on that journey. And so that's kind of how you can employ logos to become persuasive. And then to become persuasive, you can also apply ethos. And a good speech has, all three of these components. But ethos is really when you are establishing that you as a speaker are an ethical, credible, and moral source. And thus you have some relation to this topic and can speak to this topic from a certain place of authority. And then finally, I think what can often be especially, I think, moving portion of this speech, as I mentioned before, is that of your personal stories or even the personal stories of others. We as humans gravitate towards stories that make us feel connected and highlight, various aspects of the human condition. And so by using public speaking to highlight those various stories, especially if they are stories from marginalized communities, I think you can really help change other people's minds for the better, hopefully. And then finally, public speaker does help you become more confident, and has helped me become more confident in my everyday life. And I think it also helps you become especially confident when you're going into interviews, when you're speaking up in class, when you're presenting just amidst your classmates, or if you're interviewing for whether it's like a job or an interview for a college, perhaps, being more confident has really important implications and can help you become, a happier, more outgoing person in your everyday life, which is a really great skill to have. And then I think finally, public speaking can even help you become a more confident writer. And so not only does it help you figure out, um, how to really write in a more persuasive and effective and direct manner, especially helping you become concise, which is something that I have really struggled with and had to work on over the past couple of years. But I think also public speaking reminds you that it is crucial to read things aloud before you submit them to be graded or before you give them to an audience. And that is definitely something that public speaking has taught me. And it's something that applies to anybody writing essays or op-ed articles, or looking to pursue journalism. And so whatever it is, as you've hopefully seen, public speaking can really be a powerful tool for good, and can hopefully help you all, now that you've learned some public speaking tips, become better speakers and be more confident and persuasive in your everyday lives. So with that, thank you so much. And we'll be taking a couple of questions now. So if you want to chat them over.
Thank you, Jana. What a great presentation. I'm wearing my glasses so I can read the questions, which we will now take. And there's a lot, and it's 6:10, so we're going to try and get through them as quickly as we can. First question is, what key things should girl activists do to raise their platform and recognition?
That's an awesome question. So for me, I think as a girls' education activist in particular, being a public speaker has really helped me kind of raise and amplify my voice. But I think it's also helped me advocate for the voices of, more vulnerable communities. And so, as I mentioned, for example, the fact that 20 million fewer girls will be returning to school this fall because of the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic implications is something that kind of, haunts me every day, since I love learning so much. And education has had such, an important effect on my life. And so I think recognizing that you have a unique voice and that your voice has power can really help you advocate for people who don't necessarily have access to a platform. And I think in terms of all activism, one common misconception is that people don't want to hear you talk about your experience or the experiences of others, and that, you're not qualified to be an activist. But I think that that's something that's incredibly untrue. Just by virtue of being a young person or even a person on this planet, you have unique experiences you can talk about, and issues that, either relate to you or don't. And either way, you can use that to your advantage to help the communities that you care about.
Okay. Second question, what has been your hardest speech to give and why?
That's a great question. So I think I would say the hardest speech I've ever had to give was probably my TEDx youth talk. I was giving it to an audience of young people, which is not something that I had been previously particularly used to. And I really wanted to make sure to connect and be conversational with my audience. But I also wanted to be vulnerable. And it was an issue that I really cared about. And I wanted to make sure that I was doing justice to the Muslim women that I knew in the United States and in Egypt. And so to do that, I had to think long and hard about every single word in that speech and practice it over and over again to make sure that it landed the way I wanted it to, and really helped advocate for the community that I am especially grateful to for kind of raising me and helping me become the person I am today.
Okay. Question number 3. How long should a speech be for an audience with various age groups?
That's a great question. So I think it really depends what those various age groups are, and also the context of the speech. But I'd say, if you have any kids who are younger than, in the 6th grade, so younger than 10 or 11, I don't think your speech can really go over 30 minutes, especially without some sort of interactive activity, kind of like the speech warm-up we did earlier, because otherwise those kids will get really, really bored and very fidgety by the end, which is not what you want them to be. And so I think to really make sure you're keeping an audience engaged that is all ages, I would say, a good number might be like 45 minutes if you have a couple of like fourth and fifth graders sprinkled in there, and then a much older audience. And I think one tip I would really have for speaking to an audience of different ages is to make sure that your presentation is interactive and gives people the space they need to internalize everything you're saying, but also, really play a part in your presentation and feel like they are a part of it and a part of the whole thing.
Excellent. Question 4. Should your dress code mirror your audience when giving a speech?
Yeah, definitely. I think just like the same way, we were talking about attention getting devices being both super personal or super casual, or super funny. I think knowing your audience and where you're giving it can also help you figure out what you should be wearing on the day. I think no matter what you're wearing and what the audience is, a really important thing to keep in mind when you're figuring out what to wear is to make sure you're not fiddling with what you're wearing as you're speaking, because that makes me as an audience member feel nervous for you. I don't know, are you going to tug on something wrong and then it's all going to come off? Or are your glasses going to fall because you're playing with them? You never want your audience to worry about that. And so to make them feel comfortable and make you feel secure, make sure that there are no loose pieces of whatever you're wearing that you're going to get distracted by and thus distract your audience with.
Good tips. What do you do if you freeze up while speaking?
Yeah, so this is a really, really great question. I think the first thing is to take a really long, deep breath. And often when we're speaking, I think pauses can seem much longer to us than they do for our audiences. And so really take the space and time you need to recuperate, recompose your thoughts, and figure out what do you want to talk about next. Oftentimes this kind of happens when people are reading off a script, for example. They'll be reading in one spot, look down, and then lose their spot, and suddenly they don't know what to do. But I think by being confident in yourself, taking a step back, acknowledging that the people who are watching you really do want to see you succeed and want the best for you as a speaker, and then moving on from there, and even just jumping to whatever you know next and are able to talk about, even if that means not fully finishing your sentence, it's totally okay. People are much less attentive to you than you think when you're speaking and will not mind if you have a quick slip up.
Okay, we're almost at an hour, but we have one more question, so I don't want to leave that one hanging. What is the rule of thumb for how many presentation slides to use for a speech?
That's a great question. So I think more than how many slides, you have to worry about like what is the content of the slides. You never want to be directly reading off your slides, because that, we can all read. Most of the people in your audience can probably read as well. So you want to make sure that you are actually adding to the slides. And so have a lot of pictures and move through them at a fairly quick speed, but make sure that they're not so many that you have to, go through them as you're speaking, but not really cover them, because I think that leaves your audience feeling discombobulated at times.
Well, awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Jana. Thank you for everyone for joining us and being so inspired and informed. We look forward to seeing you all at our next Women's Empowerment webinar series. Stay tuned and you'll get more information on that. And thank you. This was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you for having me, Women's Foundation. Awesome.
You're welcome. It's awesome.
Bye, everyone.